Hey folks, today we're going to finish out our module on foundations of democracy. So in this section we're going to be talking about federalism, this unique division of power between the national government and state governments that we have here under our constitutional system in the United States. So our first objective is to explain how societal needs affect the constitutional allocation of power between the national and state governments. All right, so a quick review on some of the basics of federalism. Within this system, we have three different kinds of power. You have your delegated powers, which are your national powers that are exclusive to the national level. You have your reserved powers, which are exclusive to the state governments. And then you have a bunch of powers that are exercised by both levels of government, and we call those concurrent powers. So the key point for this one is the exclusive and concurrent powers of the national and state governments help to explain the negotiations over the balance of power between the two levels. So we have this nice Venn diagram here just showing you some examples. These are not exhaustive lists of all the powers that are either held by the national or the state government or concurrent powers. But here we have another example of this system that the framers of the Constitution established where there is tension between the two levels of government. Just as Madison talked about tension between the different branches of national government, which is the reason why they had separation of powers and checks and balances, there's also this tension of power between the national and state governments. They understood that both levels would inevitably try to amass as much power and authority as they could, but the other one would be waiting there to constrain them. So they're taking advantage of human nature. So I added this little point on the side, just as there is tension between the branches of national government, which helps to keep them in check within the national level. There's also this tension that exists between the national and state levels that helps to constrain the growth of national government or the growth of state government powers. All right, changing relationship between state and national governments. This division of authority between the national and state levels has not remained constant throughout our history. It has changed as times and conditions and circumstances have changed over the course of our history. So the distribution of power between federal and state governments to meet the needs of society changes, and these are some of the ways that this relationship has shifted over time. So these are different ways that the government shares power with states. We're going to talk about a few of these: grants, incentives, aid programs, federal revenue sharing, mandates, categorical grants, and block grants. So we're going to talk in just a second about block grants and categorical grants. This is money that is being given by the federal government to state governments with, depending on the type of grant, some different amount of restrictions attached to it. Overall, throughout our history, if you go between 1789 and today, the overall trend has certainly been in favor of increasing federal power, particularly since the early 20th century, especially since like the 1930s. We started to have national crises like the Great Depression in the 1930s, followed immediately thereafter by World War II. One of the trends that we see throughout history is that when we have these periods of crisis, and we can even look at what's going on in our world right now with the COVID-19 crisis, when something like that happens, people tend to look to the federal government to take control of things and get things done. And so they're much more willing to give authority and power to the federal government during those times of crisis. And what usually ends up happening is they keep a lot of that power even after the crisis is done, and it has gradually led to a buildup of federal power at the expense of the states over time. Hear people talking about why isn't the federal government doing this and that as far as testing and providing funding for small businesses and doing all these things. People are much more apt to look to the federal government to take care of business during a period of crisis like we're seeing right now. Okay, so let's talk about, we'll review these two major types of grants. This is money coming from the federal government to the state governments. Broadly speaking, you can divide any type of a federal grant into one of these two categories. You either have a categorical grant or a block grant. Categorical grants are federal money going to the states that is accompanied by really stringent conditions and requirements for its use. Okay? So yeah, they're going to give you the money, but there's going to be a lot of forms you have to fill out. There's a lot of specifics on exactly how it has to be used and conditions you have to meet. So I just put some examples of categorical grant programs that are pretty well known throughout our country. Medicaid, this is a program that is designed to provide health care for the needy in our country. And it's kind of an interesting program in that it's funded by the federal government, but really administered by the states. So when the federal government gives the states that Medicaid money, there are, as you can imagine, a whole lot of restrictions and requirements placed upon the states as far as how they have to use that money. Food stamp program, same kind of thing. Federal money that's given to the states to use for food assistance for people. Head Start is a program that provides child care for people in need. Same kind of thing, lots of requirements attached to it. Highway funding. We've talked about in class earlier in the year how highway funding is provided to the states for interstate highways and that type of thing. But there are some requirements attached to it, like, for example, you have to set your drinking age at 21. You have to set your blood alcohol content for what's considered a DUI at 0.08. And there are a whole bunch of other requirements as far as exactly how that highway funding has to be used and requirements you have to meet. Education funding. Federal government doesn't really provide a whole lot of money for education, but it's enough that the states really can't do without it. So the federal government uses that to leverage a lot of specific requirements and conditions and things that states have to meet as far as what their public education systems look like. So those are all categorical grants, lots of strings attached. Block grants are also federal money given to the states, but generally for a much more broad purpose with relatively few conditions attached to it. Now, that does not mean there are no conditions attached to it or that you can use it for anything you want. They are going to give you general purpose and some broad conditions that have to be met, but they're not nearly as stringent as categorical grants. These are the types of things that will be favored typically by political conservatives and advocates of local control who think states and local governments are in best position to actually figure out what to use that money for. So some examples of these: there's a broad block grant administered by the federal government called the Social Services Block Grant. This is for programs that we would probably broadly consider welfare programs. We studied this a little bit earlier in my class, how they made some significant changes to this in the 1990s in terms of allowing states a lot more local control over how to administer welfare programs as long as they meet some just general conditions. And then there's another one called Community Development Block Grants, which are money that's given by the federal government to state and local governments to kind of redevelop cities and provide public housing for people and things like that. Again, not a whole lot of strings attached to it. There's a lot of local control that they can exercise on that. So over time, just a note to add to this, categorical grants have become more popular among the federal government because this is what the federal government can use to enforce policy, to enact some of its policy objectives at the state level. So they can take an issue like public education or highway funding that's not really specifically a delegated power of the national government. It's not necessarily something they have a constitutional role or responsibility in, but if they want to see certain policies enacted, they can get around that by offering money or threatening to withhold money if the states do not comply with these certain conditions. So it's another way that the federal government has increased its power relative to the states over time. Okay, that brings us to objective 2, which is to explain how the appropriate balance of power between national and state governments have been interpreted differently over time. So here again, we have the idea that this relationship of federalism has not been stagnant. It's been interpreted differently over time. Okay, so one of the ways in which federalism has changed over the years is in how the Constitution has changed, and both formally and informally. So the point that they want us to take a look at here is that the interpretation of the 10th and 14th Amendments, the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, and other enumerated and implied powers is at the heart of the debate over the balance of power between the national and state governments. So let's take a look at those things more closely. The 10th Amendment, added as part of the original Bill of Rights. 10th Amendment really establishes a pretty clear line. It really provides the whole reason why we call the powers of the states reserved powers, because it says any powers that are not specifically delegated to the national government are reserved to the states. So if you read that amendment really strictly and closely, it would suggest that there's a clear dividing line between where the jurisdiction and responsibility of the federal government ends and where the state government responsibility begins. So a clear line of delineation. That would, at the time that the 10th Amendment had just been passed, that would suggest a very clear division of authority. All right, fast forwarding about 80 years or so, 70 or 80 years to just after the Civil War period, the 14th Amendment applies the due process and equal protection to the actions of states. So this was intended to provide protections to people wherever they lived in the United States. So this has tended to decrease state power and autonomy. One concrete example of this is we've talked about the incorporation doctrine. This is the process by which the Supreme Court uses those 14th Amendment protections of due process and equal protection to take elements of the Bill of Rights and apply them to the states. Remember, before the incorporation doctrine, it was understood that the protections provided by the Bill of Rights only protected you from actions of the federal government. But because of the 14th Amendment, which is used for the incorporation doctrine, they then take those protections and apply them to also protect you from actions of the state governments. So that means states have less autonomy and authority to maybe interpret some of those basic civil liberties that you have differently than other states would. The Commerce Clause. This is part of Article 1, which says that the federal government, Congress, has the authority to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. So the debate here comes over surrounding what exactly is interstate commerce. And so we talked a little bit in class about the debates over things like drug laws and civil rights. Does the federal government really have the ability to go in and regulate something like marijuana within a state, even if it is entirely produced and consumed within a single state? Well, yeah, so far the Supreme Court has determined that even something like that, because it affects an overall interstate market for a product, can still be considered interstate commerce and can therefore be regulated by the federal government. The Civil Rights Act was based on the Commerce Clause. Again, we have something that you might not immediately consider commerce, but because it's involving, in some cases, commercial activity, it was therefore deemed to be related to interstate commerce and something that the federal government could get its hands on. So this has led to a lot of disagreements between state governments and the federal government over exactly how far the Commerce Clause should allow to be taken. And then finally, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which is what gives us implied powers at the national government level. How broadly should that be interpreted in terms of providing for extensive implied powers, right? So how narrowly should you define what exactly is allowed as an implied power? All right. Now, the Supreme Court has also had a significant role in redefining the limits of federalism. So the key point here is the balance of power between the national and state governments has changed over time based on U.S. Supreme Court interpretation of cases such as, so two cases here that you need to know. These are two of our landmark Supreme Court cases. McCulloch v. Maryland from 1819. This was the case involving a national bank that the United States government had established. And remember, there's nothing in the Constitution that explicitly gives the government the right to create a national bank, but Congress had interpreted its implied powers over banking and commerce and things like that to provide the ability for them to establish a national bank. Maryland was doing all that it could to try to put that national bank out of business and tax it into oblivion. So in this ruling, the Supreme Court determined that Congress does have an extensive implied powers, including the ability to establish a national bank, which are necessary to supplement its enumerated powers. And it established and supported the idea of supremacy of the U.S. Constitution and federal laws over state laws. So a couple of very important takeaways from that case. Much more recent case in 1995 involving the Commerce Clause, United States v. Lopez. So in this case, regarded a federal law that had been passed that banned anyone from carrying a firearm within a certain distance of a public school anywhere in the United States, and it was based on the Commerce Clause. Well, the Supreme Court looked at this case and determined that this law, as it was written, really was not closely enough connected to actual commerce, especially the interstate variety, to allow it to be something that the federal government can regulate under the Commerce Clause. So it struck down that law. So this is really one of the rare examples over history where the Supreme Court has kind of stepped things back a little bit and actually ceded a little bit more authority to the states and taken it away from the federal government. But overall, the trend has mostly been in favor of increasing federal control. All right, our final objective is to explain how the distribution of powers among the three federal branches and between national and state governments impacts policymaking. All right, so just a few final thoughts here. Similar to what we said about separation of powers and checks and balances in one of our previous modules, where we said that it provides multiple access points for stakeholders and institutions to influence public policy. So before we talked about that in terms of at the national level, you have different institutions where you can access the policymaking process either through the courts or the Congress or the executive branch. Here we're talking about another example of how you have different options to try to get your policies enacted, but we're talking about the state and then federal level. So I added this point of clarification on the right that even when a stakeholder, so think of yourself as an interest group or a political party, even when you're shut out of the policymaking process, either at the federal level or at the state level, you still have the other one to try to work to achieve your policy goals. So just a couple examples that came up off the top of my head. Democrats and liberals who might favor more stringent environmental controls and minimum wage, a higher minimum wage, things like that. They're currently kind of shut out of the federal government to a large extent. They do have the House of Representatives, but they're shut out of the executive branch. They don't have the Senate, so there's not a whole lot that more liberal stakeholders have as far as those environmental and minimum wage rules. But they have had the options and have had some success at enacting those policies at the state level in different places around the country. In California, in some of your more liberal states, they have gone in through the state governments and enacted very stringent environmental policy and minimum wage laws and things like that. So, and there are lots of examples. There are examples of places where people are shut out at the state level and instead they work at the federal level to have the kinds of policies enacted that they would like to see. And then the final point is that national policymaking is constrained by the sharing of power between and among the three branches and state governments. So we said earlier that the framers included this tension between, not only between the three branches of government at the national level, but between states and the national government so that they would constrain each other. So my point here is that the shift that we've seen over time toward greater federal power would probably be even larger, even more acute if not for gridlock at the federal level, for checks and balances at the federal level, and of course for the tension between states and federal power as well. All right, that's going to conclude our study of the foundations of democracy. Next week we will get into AP Unit 2, which is the interactions among the branches of government. So we'll talk about the different institutions and some of their characteristics.